Good day, and thank you for joining the HRO Today Service System Technology Association Thought Leadership Council on Talent Management. My name is Zachary Misko, the Executive Director for the Association, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this month's session on talent management. Our session is titled Legendary Leaders, Effective Storytelling for Growing Impact, Influence, and Income. You probably saw when you registered that we've got a really great speaker joining us today, and before I introduce Karen, I'd like to tell you a little bit about more of what she'll be talking about, as well as level set and provide some information about our association. So from a topic standpoint, we always look at different topics and key trends, and those topics that are of interest within our members in regards to talent management. As I talked to Karen and we prepared for today's webinar, it was obvious that this was a topic that would be important to our members. Over 70% of employees don't care about you or your company, meaning millions go down the drain every year in lost income. It's a tricky problem to solve, yet the question always comes down to how do you inspire the best in people? Well, the answer is through your stories. Storytelling is now an essential core competency for leaders seeking engagement, though most leaders are never taught how to tell stories or how to apply them until now. And that's why we're here, and we've got Karen Dietz with us today. In this, learn what works and what doesn't in storytelling, how to identify stories you've never thought of before, how you can make your messages stick, techniques for ending your story the right way to move people to action, and a method for listening to the best stories out of others in order to build relationships, trust, and commitment. I'm very excited to have Dr. Karen Dietz with us today. And before I get started and introduce her, let me tell you a little bit more about the HRO Today Service System Technology Association. Our association is a membership channel and community dedicated to professional development. We provide research, industry trends, expert panel discussions, webinars, peer-to-peer networking, best practice sharing, all through connecting practitioners, providers, and industry thought leaders. Membership in our association provides access to our Thought Leadership Council, networking opportunities, webinars, research. Our most recent research was on talent acquisition and the metrics within talent acquisition, cost per hire, diversity, source of hire, and that full research report is now available to all members via our website at www.hrotoday.com. Lots of member-only content, discounts to our events, our HRO Today forums, as well as a digital subscription to our HRO Today magazine. The Thought Leadership Councils occur monthly. These are opportunities for our memberships to learn and understand more about 4 different industry verticals: talent acquisition, talent management, employee relations and services, and outsourcing. Each month, the second week of each month, we host these Thought Leadership Councils via GoToMeeting. All of the content is available on demand via our website. If you should have questions during today's webinar, you will notice that you have an opportunity to enter your question on the screen, and if time allows, we'll ensure that we ask Karen those questions at the end of today's session. If you're listening to this via recording, please feel free to reach out to Karen via the contact information that she's provided, or reach out to myself directly through the association, and I'll be sure to get you those answers. As I said, we do hold events throughout Europe, APAC, and North America. Our next event is May 2nd through the 4th in the Windy City of Chicago. We look forward to seeing you there. More information about our program, speakers, and the full agenda will be available on our website. Contact information, our Global Marketing Manager, Scott Ferr's information is posted, as well as myself, Zachary Misko. All right, I'm ready to move into the content, and I'm excited to learn more from Dr. Karen Dietz. I'm excited to have her with us. Dr. Dietz is the best-selling author of the book Business Storytelling For Dummies, a veteran of business storytelling, and she is a recognized global expert in her field. She opened the 2013 TEDx conference in San Diego with her talk on the power of storytelling and listening. Karen has also built the world's largest free online library of the best in business storytelling. She has helped Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits and entrepreneurs, and providers provide story workshops, coaching, and consulting on leadership, culture, marketing, branding, and sales. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Dietz. And Karen, please take it away. I'll turn controls over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Zachary, for that wonderful introduction. And let's see, let me get this up here. And where is it? I clicked on the right button. Let me see. I'm not seeing it.
I see your screen now.
Yeah, I see my screen, but I don't see the presentation, actually.
I don't see your presentation either.
Well, I wonder where it went.
Well, isn't this a great opportunity for a story that you'll have to tell?
It is. It is.
Do you have your PowerPoint available to reopen? If not, I can open mine.
Yeah,
there it is. There it is.
Oh, there it is. Okay, great. So let me get into screen mode. All right. Yeah. Okay, great. A little technical glitch there.
Not a problem.
All right. Thanks so much. Well, let's get started. And yeah, after that great introduction, I mean, Zachary, you did a great job in going through some of the highlights of what we're going to talk about today. And you know, still though, it begs the question, why would we want to pay attention to storytelling in particular? And all the things we could do about engagement, building leadership, creating strong cultures. There are many ways and many tools and many activities we have to help in that area. But why would we want to pay attention to storytelling in particular? So I have some thoughts about that, and as we go through the rest of the presentation, we'll continue to answer that question. But to get us started in understanding the why we would want to pay attention here, here's an example. Lakeland Health is a hospital that employs about 4,000 people, and they generate about 500 million per year. But you know, they every year had an ongoing problem, and that was their customer satisfaction scores or their patient satisfaction scores. And they continued to be laggards in that, with every year scores anywhere between the 25th and 50th percentile. And this was way below their competition. But also, any time a hospital falls below a certain threshold in their customer satisfaction scores, they pay a penalty in terms of reduced reimbursement rates from the government and insurance companies. So they have tried everything. They tried everything to improve these scores. And nothing was working. They couldn't move the needle. And so the CEO and his direct reports, they started to brainstorm, and they decided to take a different tactic than to throw, other than, you know, typical of throwing money at it or trying to improve work processes and systems. And they decided what they really needed was maybe an attitude change. And so they launched a program called Bring Your Heart to Work. And it was all about really everybody in the organization focusing on how well, not only on how well they cared for patients, but how much they cared about their patients. And then they set this big, hairy, audacious goal of getting their customer satisfaction scores up into the 90th percentile in 90 days. So what did they do that made this work? Well, they really focused on storytelling and stories. What they did is that whenever a patient or a colleague reported a small act of heartfelt service, a senior leader would show up within minutes to personally thank that sort of warm-hearted associate. And surrounded by their nearby coworkers, the leader would then retell the story of what happened and then thank the individual. So what happened at the end of 90 days? Well, at the end of 90 days, they had retold 6,000 stories, which I think is amazing. It's just mind-boggling, like 6,000 stories in 90 days, and their customer satisfaction scores were up in the 95th percentile, which was a huge, huge shift. First time that had ever happened in the history of Lakeland. Then there's research that came out a few years ago about the difference between storytelling and story doing companies. Storytelling companies are companies who tell stories, but it's interesting. I don't even like the word storytelling, and I've been doing this work for many, many, many years. And I don't like the word storytelling because it creates a picture in our minds of somebody or a leader standing up and telling us things. When actually, the best way to think about storytelling, particularly to increase your impact and your influence and subsequently your income, is to focus on story sharing, which is the exchange of stories back and forth. And then there's another level of working with stories, which is what is called the story doing company. And when you are a story doing company, you're not only telling stories, but you're really walking your talk around the stories and with the stories. We know how easy it is for, let's say, marketing to be telling great stories out in the marketplace about an organization, but when we look internal into the organization, what the organization is promoting outside doesn't measure up to what's actually happening inside. So story doing companies are those where their cultures and their stories match, internal and external match. And some research was done a few years ago about the difference story doing companies were experiencing in terms of annualized revenue growth and also annualized share price. And regarding the revenue growth, storytelling companies were, on average, experiencing like 6.1% in revenue growth a year. Story-doing companies were actually experiencing 10.4% annual growth. So a bit more, yeah.
I'm still seeing the Y slide. I don't know if you are advancing or if you're still talking. I just wanted to make sure you were aware of that.
Yep, I'm still on the Y.
Okay, perfect. I got nervous and I wanted to make sure. Thank you so much.
No, you're doing great, Zachary. Thank you. So anyway, story doing companies actually receive or experience more annualized revenue growth. And in terms of share price, storytelling companies, this I find really interesting. They were at a negative 4.4%, where story doing companies were experiencing a positive 5.6% in terms of annualized share price. And if anybody wants to know that research, I can give that to you. But you can see these are very powerful expressions of how storytelling can produce great results for companies. And if you're fundraising, I mean, this was a nonprofit example, but I've worked both at nonprofits and for-profits, and it works the same in terms of raising money. But the one example that I think is the most impressive is from Columbia University. And their alumni association wanted to raise some money for their programs, and so what they did is they shared one story of one young person who had received benefits of the program and the difference it had made in that young person's life. And within 24 hours, that one story generated $6.8 million in funds. So again, these are not extraordinary results. These are the kinds of results that I see repeated all the time. So this is why storytelling is so important for organizations. And there are other reasons too. So let's figure out what some of those other reasons are. It really is the richest and most efficient means, stories are, that we have to immediately create a connection, also build trust and believability, but also move people to action. And that's the difference between Hollywood storytelling and business storytelling. You know, Hollywood storytelling is for sure entertaining, and those stories can move us. But you really don't go to a movie in order to necessarily change your behavior or be inspired to take action in some way. But all of our business stories that we want to work with, we do want them to move people to action in some way. And there are certain ways to craft stories so that happens. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that's the big difference between Hollywood and business storytelling. And your stories within your organization are the most effective ways, the most powerful ways you have to convey your vision or your mission, definitely the values that you want to promote in the organization, and they help create your own unique executive presence because your stories are unique to you, right? And it creates your unique leadership style and conveys who you are as a unique leader and as a unique person. So that's really, really invaluable. Stories also can spark change. And in this webinar, we won't have an opportunity to go through the actual model about the cycles of change that an organization, let's say you have a change initiative going on, the cycles of change, the phases of change that everyone goes through. And there's a model that links stories to those cycles of change or phases of change, so that as a leader you will know exactly which stories to start sharing when, depending on what part of the change cycle or change phase you're in. And all of this grows your influence and your impact. The more you can share stories, the more that happens. But let's spend a few minutes talking about what makes a real story work, what makes stories work, why are they so powerful. And I thought of originally sharing a story that's located in Paris, and then at the last minute I found a story that I think is more apropos for us. So here you go, and then I'll ask you some questions when we are done. So it was in the early 1980s. And Sterling Price, this guy Sterling Price, worked as a cook at Pizza Hut in Springdale, Arkansas. This is before there were any national sandwich chains in town, like Subway or Blimpies or Quiznos. And one day, Sterling says, a lady came in to the Pizza Hut and asked if we had any meatball sandwiches. When I told her we didn't, she got very upset, sort of like on the verge of tears. So Sterling said that even though they didn't have meatball sandwiches on the menu, they did have all the makings of a meatball sandwich. You know, the rolls and the meatballs and the tomato sauce and the mozzarella cheese. And since they had all the agreements, he just told her that he would make the sandwich up for her and just ring it up as another sandwich item that was on the menu. So she waited, and when she got the sandwich, she just thanked him profusely and then explained that her husband really was very, very sick and had lost his appetite. She was desperate to get him to eat something and had asked him if there was, anything that sounded good. Well, he told her that, he might be able to eat a bit of meatball sandwich. So off she went to go find one, and she'd already been to several restaurants, and no one could help her. So that Pizza Hut was the last stop she was going to make before going home empty-handed. So she took the sandwich home, and Sterling didn't think much more about it until the next day when she called Pizza Hut and asked to speak to him. She told Sterling that her husband had eaten as much of the sandwich as he could manage and was very grateful that she was able to get it for him. It was the most complete and enjoyable meal he'd had in days. Then she explained a bit more about her husband's condition. Turns out he had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer a few months earlier. His loss of appetite was the least of his unpleasant symptoms, but perhaps the only one that she could provide any comfort for. So it meant a lot to her that that Sterling had been so flexible with their menu and had made that sandwich for her. Then she told Sterling that her husband actually had passed away quietly during that night, and that sandwich was his last meal. She was crying by then, but thanked Sterling again and said it had helped make her husband's last day of life a little bit more bearable. And Sterling says it touches me still to this day. And he says it's a great reminder that even seemingly small things we do for others can have a big impact on their lives. So let me ask you a few things about this story, and you can put your responses in the chat box. Now, when I ask a question, there are no wrong answers, right? So I'm really interested, though, in what happened for you as you were listening to that story. So the first thing, how many people saw images come to their mind? And what kind of images did you see? Did you see Pizza Hut? Did you see the woman? Did you see Sterling, right? Did you see the meatball sandwich? What was it? What did you see in your mind's eye as you were hearing that story? So, Zachary, are there any answers that people have come up with yet?
Hold on here. Let me refresh and look for you. Okay, just a moment here. It looks like people are typing, but I don't have responses just yet, Karen.
All right. That's okay. As they come in, you can start sharing those. And the other question I have to ask people, well, if you saw things, I bet you might have maybe smelled something too. Maybe you smelled pizza, right, from Pizza Hut. Maybe you smelled that meatball sandwich because that has a distinctive smell. And so very often people, when we're sharing stories, they not only see things, they can smell things. Maybe, God, you know, that meatball sandwich or that pizza sometimes stimulates our taste buds, and we can remember what the food, you know, tasted like. And so sometimes we experience that. So if you experience anything in terms of smell or taste, that would be great too. So you can share about that. So Zachary, are we getting some answers posted yet?
They're still coming through. I see typing. I just don't see answers yet, Karen.
Okay, no worries. Um, you know, whenever I do this at a workshop, we get so many different and interesting answers. And different people will see different things. Different people will smell things. Not everybody smells things. Not everybody tastes things. But there are people who do. And sometimes they'll experience touch, right? They'll feel something on their skin. Or they'll feel a particular emotion, right? And so there was a lot of emotional content in this particular story, and so it would not surprise me at all if people experienced different kinds of emotions as they were listening to the story. So,
yeah, and Karen, so people are saying they're visualizing Pizza Hut and the kind person trying to help the customer. Mm-hmm. They're visualizing marinara sauce with oozing yummy cheese melted on top.
See, yeah.
They are visualizing the meal. They could actually imagine themselves being there the way you told the story with rich detail.
Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely.
Compassion for the narrator and anticipating the story ending sadly brings back personal memories. Visualize the whole story, and particularly the lady's emotions and Sterling's good nature. So those are some of the responses I'm seeing, Karen.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, you know, the power of stories lies in a few things that are happening. One is that because stories stimulate our senses, you know, what we see, smell, taste, touch, or feel, it really, as soon as I share a story, starts activating everyone's imaginations. But then there's another thing that's going on with stories is that there's also our left brain is engaged because we're analyzing what's happening and trying to make sense of it, and we are anticipating what is coming next. Because we have both the left brain and the right brain being activated and all of our senses, we talk of stories as being a whole brain, whole body experience. And there's no other form of communication that is as rich as sharing a story because it stimulates so much of our brains and our physical beings. And we want all parts of us engaged when we are listening to or sharing a story. There's another thing that someone else already identified when they wrote in the chat box is that, yes, I didn't give that many details of this story. Y'all were filling in your own mind details as they connected with you or as they reflected your past experiences. So stories also sort of activate our personal memories, and we each fill in the details, and then we each make the story meaningful for ourselves in our own way. That's very, very powerful. And in fact, stories have been around. We've been sharing stories for like 100,000 years or more. So we know that they work. And I sometimes tease my executives when I'm working with them. It's like we get so involved in business speak and professional language in the work environment, we sometimes, think that, oh gosh, stories, what place do they really have? Or if I share a story, will I be viewed as less competent? But actually, when you start sharing stories, just not only do you get so involved in telling the story, but so do other people listening to you. And when we talk about engagement, I mean, that really is a very powerful form of engagement that we want to continue to promote. But what does this really mean for leadership, right? Well, it means these four things. First of all, story connects people together. For years I've wanted neuroscience scientists to take brain scans of someone telling a story and somebody listening to a story, at the same time. And a few years ago, they finally did, and this is what they discovered. They discovered that, as we've already experienced, when somebody is telling a story and somebody is listening to a story, well, the storyteller, all areas of the brain were lit up. For the person listening to the story, the same areas of the brain were lit up, and there was one additional part of the brain that was activated, and that was the part of the brain that's anticipating what is coming next. But what's really interesting, that's fascinating in and of itself, but what I thought was really interesting was that the time it took for the storyteller's brain and the story listener's brain to entrain, connect and entrain, was actually like a nanosecond. It was a very short period of time before both brains were connected. And so storytelling connects us together in very, very powerful ways. The other thing about stories that I love is that when you share a story, it sparks a story in someone else. And that maybe as you were listening to the story about Pizza Hut and Sterling's experience there with one of his customers, it sparked a story in your mind about an experience that you might have had that was related in some way. So what happens is that when you spark a story in another person, they often want to share it in return. And I'm so sorry that in this kind of medium, we didn't have an opportunity to share some of those stories or listen to some of those stories that were sparked by this first story of Sterling's experience at Pizza Hut. Another really key ingredient of storytelling is that stories travel. So how many of you feel like if you after this webinar went back to work, or maybe you're at home this evening, you could, in your own way, share the story that I just told about Pizza Hut? And when I ask that question, most people say yes, they absolutely could share that story. And so it's very important to recognize, particularly as leaders, that as you share a story, that it will travel. Not everybody may tell that story, but a whole bunch of people will. And of course, in marketing, we talk about this in terms of word of mouth marketing. Right? I share a story, somebody else out of my presence shares the story that I just shared with somebody else, and if I did it right, then that story is something about either my company, my product or service, how I approach all of that, and how I am unique, or how my business or my product or service is unique from other people. So stories travel. And then the last one is stories actually are little mini simulations. This is often unrecognized in business storytelling. But as you are listening to a story, you're actually not only making it your own, right, by filling in your own details, but you're actually trying it on. Right? So this is really important when we talk about being able to share a story to promote a particular value, or to promote a particular behavior that we want in our organizations. When we share that story, people actually have an opportunity to try on that value, right? Or if we're looking at products and services and sharing stories about that, then people get to try on that product or service. That actually serves as a little mini simulation about what the main point of the story is. So these 4 points are your real leverage points and leverage opportunities for working with stories. So you can see how powerful these, just these 4 things in and of themselves can be for leadership and influence and impact. Now, there are 2 things that you really need to know, and that is the difference between story mechanics and story dynamics. So I'm going to talk about story dynamics first, and then I'll talk a little bit about story dynamics. Or I'm going to do it the other, yeah, story dynamics and then story mechanics. But to tell you what the difference is right now, story mechanics is when you end up mastering the elements of storytelling, you know, like what makes a good story? What are all the elements that I need to include in order to tell a story really well? And what are story structures that I can use to craft my story? So story mechanics is really about your tools that you have available. And, you know, just like an artist needs to know all about their paints and their paint brushes and their canvas, so too business storytellers need to know about the elements of a story and story structures. But, you know, this is where most organizations stop. You know, they'll bring someone in to do a workshop, and the workshop will talk about, okay, how do you craft a good story? What are the mechanics of doing that? But where the real sweet spot is, particularly with leaders, is focusing on the story dynamics, right? And story dynamics is all about listening to and evoking stories to build strong relationships. Now, you need to know the story mechanics, but you've got to really focus on working the story dynamics if you're going to see a difference in your organization or in your leadership. So let's dig into what story dynamics are a little bit more. There are 3 parts to story dynamics. One is learning how to evoke a story from others. We call this the art of the question. Then there's story listening. How do you listen to a story? What's the best way to listen to a story? And there are specific ways you're going to want to listen to a story for maximum effect. And then what about story sharing? Right? What do I need to know about that? Story listening, I'll tackle that one first. And actually in my TED Talk, I go through the 3-step process in great detail about how to listen to a story. But the quick and dirty guide is, first of all, you just listen delightedly. And you're not listening with a particular agenda. You're listening to sort of bring the best story out possible that you possibly can from the person who's telling a story. So it's not listening to, you know, figure out what you're going to say next or how you're going to respond. You just kind of put all of that on hold, and you just listen very deeply to that person who's sharing a story. So if you want to know more, go listen to my TED Talk. I could spend a whole hour just on story listening. And those are the high points of that. Now, story evoking. This is how to ask the right questions in order to bring a story out from someone that you want. You know, you want to listen to their story. So how do you do that? Often what we do is we will say something like, hey, describe to me this situation. And if you say something like that, you will get a good description. Or you will say, well, what did you think about that? And if you ask that question, you'll get a good opinion. But neither of those phrases will evoke a story. So there are some magic words that we use to evoke a story. And these magic words are, tell me about what happened when. Tell me about the time when. Right? Tell me about your experience with this. Right? So the opening is always the same. Tell me about something, right? Those are your magic words that will evoke a story. And then you're asking for an experience. Tell me what happened when, right? And that automatically people start sharing a story with you. They'll put opinions and descriptions aside very often. Tell me about the experience you had. That's directly asking for a story because you're asking for the experience. So story evoking is really important. And I remember I worked with Princess Cruises a few years ago, and they wanted to collect their customer service, I mean, not their customer service, they wanted to collect their customer stories. And they were very curious about whether the values and the brand principles that they had been focused on for so long were actually matching their customers' experiences. So they sent a film crew out on a cruise, and the film crew would just go up to somebody and say, so how's your cruise going? And they would get, you know, some like one sentence response, right? And they would keep asking those kinds of descriptive or opinion-based questions and not getting the results that they wanted. So they hired me, and I went with a colleague, and we ended up doing these story sharing circles with passengers on the cruise ship. And we got so much great material. It was really fabulous. And all we were doing was using these story prompts to help people understand what we wanted to hear, and also to spark stories within them. So story evoking is really great. And then story sharing, this is really important. And you know, we think linearly, oh, I share a story and then listen to one in return, but sometimes it's listening for a story first and then sharing a story in return. And there's no one, you know, way is better. There's not, you know, start always by sharing a story, or start always by listening to a story. You'll know in each situation what the right step is. But know that it's a dynamic. And particularly know that if you do a presentation and you share a story, or your entire presentation is a story, get ready for people to come up afterwards and want to share stories in return for you. So I think this is one mistake that a lot of leaders make. Okay, I'm off the podium, boom, back to work, or you know, back to my meeting, or whatever, and they don't allow themselves or others the time to chat and share and do some story swapping back and forth. So that's about story dynamics. Let's talk a little bit more about story mechanics. And people always ask me, okay, so what's the best way to get started? You know, what's a structure that I can use? And so this is a structure that I share all the time. It's a good structure to work with when you're just starting out with stories. Now, it's true, there are different kinds of structures, and part of mastering storytelling is knowing those different structures, and you'll get there eventually. But if you're just starting out, right, here's a great structure that will get you the results that you're looking for. So it's called the charm structure, right? Because you want your stories to be charming. So what does the acronym CHARM stand for? Well, C stands for setting the context. In other words, it's sharing the setting. And of course, when we did the Pizza Hut story. I set the context by saying it was in the early 1990s, and Sterling Price was one of the workers who was there, and he was working for Pizza Hut as a cook, and that it was before, any other sandwich chains out there, existed. So that's the context. And then the H stands for hindrance. Hindrance, or the problem, or the struggle, or the trouble that someone is having. And in the Pizza Hut story, the hindrance was this woman who had been driving all around town trying to find a meatball sandwich for her husband and failing. And there she is at Pizza Hut making a request for one. So the A stands for action. All right. So what did Sterling do? He made that meatball sandwich from the food that they had available in the restaurant. And then R is the result. What was the result that happened? So this woman goes home. Her husband eats a little bit of it, is satisfied. Now, he also died that night, but the result really is about the peace that that last meal gave to both her and her husband. And then the meaning that was ascribed to that story that Sterling shared was that you never really can know how even the smallest steps that you take can have such a big impact. Right? It's important to remember that small things that you do can have a big impact. So that is the meaning statement. Now, you might have a different meaning statement for that story. Right? You can use that story and share a different kind of meaning at the end, and that would be just fine. The main point, though, is that very often that meaning is left off of a story, and as leaders we always need to provide meaning. And one of the easiest ways to do that, since we know people who are listening to the story will make their own meaning, you can share your meaning. So, well, what this means to me is, this is the takeaway that I have that story. You may have a different takeaway, but this is what it means to me. It allows your audience to ascribe, create their meaning for the story, and you also share how that story is meaningful for you. So that's the charm structure. And it's a great structure to use to get started with stories and storytelling. But as we work in an organization, not only do we need to master storytelling so we can tell great stories, but we also need to understand how stories work in an organization and how we can work with stories on a larger scale. And again, we're going to use the same acronym, that same CHARM acronym, because it's time to get your charm on with these stories. And the first thing that we want to do is start collecting stories. That means listening for stories around the organization. And I want to tell you how important collecting is and actually being able to write these down or preserve them in some way. Because that Pizza Hut story that I shared, Sterling himself shares that story. He shares it with his coworkers and his shift manager, but you know what? It never went beyond that. It never became a story that the whole of Pizza Hut ever used because no one ever wrote it down. No one ever recognized that that was a story to grab and to retell throughout the organization, which is really, sad that they missed that opportunity. So collecting stories is really, really important. Then you want to hone your stories. That means craft them and craft them well, and keep working on them until you really like the story, and that you can take that story and you can expand it and contract it depending on the situation you're in. So honing your stories is important too. And then of course we want to apply those stories. I think the greatest mistake people make is thinking that, oh, stories just belong in sales or marketing. And, that's a great place for, it's a great place to get started with storytelling. But there are so many more applications in an organization than just marketing and sales. You really have the ability to bring it into training, knowledge management, knowledge transfer, when you're onboarding folks, even in the recruitment process, and when you're focusing on innovation and promoting innovation and design. They're just almost everywhere you could possibly to apply stories in an organization. That's a good home for them. And then another part of working with stories is to renew your stories. And you know what this is like. We all have our favorite stories to tell. And sometimes we get tired of them. And we learn to switch them up or change them around so that we continue to enjoy sharing those stories. And so organizations periodically must pay attention to renewing those stories and bringing new life back into them. And then the last, the M, stands for mining stories. And this is where you get to dig deep into really what's going on with your stories. Stories, they can have multiple meanings. There's great depth to them. There are more than, often, there's more than one message to a particular story. And so digging deep into your stories and learning more about them and what's really going on is can be really critical for an organization. And that's one of the things we did with Princess Cruises, is we took all of the 230-some stories and usable items that we had collected, and I created a story depth chart so that we could really dig into the stories and understand customer need states and archetypes and all kinds of things that were going on in those stories that at a surface glance you wouldn't necessarily pick up. So that's a great way to think about how to work with stories in your organization. Well, if you wanted to go back to work today and get started with stories, what would you do, right? Well, I have some steps for you, but I think before we get to those concrete steps, you probably need to know the kinds of stories that you should be looking for. So there are 4 categories of stories. They're not in any order, right? I'll list them 1, 2, 3, 4, but they're, as I said, it's not a linear process. But one story you definitely want to be able to tell is your origin story, right? The origin story of the organization, or the story of how you came to the organization. Right? We often hear origin stories, or we ask for origin stories when we're recruiting talent. And we say, okay, so tell me your journey, right, for in your career that brought you here. Tell me your leadership journey. Those are all parts of an origin story. So origin stories are pretty important because we always want to know, how did you get here, right? Tell me what that was like. Tell me your journey. How did the organization get started, right? So then there's another category of stories called your people and results stories, or your PR stories. I think these are the easiest to collect. And these are the stories of not only the people within your organization and how they've overcome obstacles, how they've made contributions, how they've done amazing things for you and your organization, but it's also stories externally of your customers and how they have been able to do extraordinary things or accomplish amazing activities, or have had fabulous results in some way because of your product or service. Now, the important thing to pay attention to with the PR stories is that you or your organization is not necessarily the hero. right? You're always the secondary characters because it's really about the other people and what they were able to do, and just because they happen to engage with you. So think about that a little bit. About your PR stories, they're all around you, and they're one of the easiest to start collecting. And then you have your future story, which is the future that you're creating, and the difference your product or service makes out in the world, with people, with your communities, with the planet, right? And so this is a pretty important story, particularly now these days when so many consumers are interested in the social impact that your business is having on the world. And so developing that future story is really important. And then the last category of stories, not last in terms of less than, but the last of the four, is the why I stories, right? These are why are you standing up in front of people talking? What is your commitment? You know, why do I show up every day doing this work that I do? Lord knows it's not easy, right? But I'm committed. So it's why I. Why do you participate every day in the work, in the projects, whatever? If you're asking people to commit to your organization, they want to know your commitment to them and to the organization. So why I stories are also really important and often a neglected story to tell. So we know we want to do that. So those are to get started, your 4 stories, kinds of stories that you want to look for and start promoting and telling. So let's start talking about sharing your charmers. Oh, let me go back. And as I said, you know, marketing, culture, strengthening, executive presence, engagement, to enroll others in your vision, to convey values. These are all reasons that you would want to share your charmers, share your stories. So what are your next steps? Well, of course, you want to find your stories. That means listening for stories. You want to craft them using the charm structure. That'll get a good way to get you started. And then practice telling them, you know, you don't get to be a great storyteller unless you're telling lots of stories. So to tell lots of stories and you'll get great at telling them. But that means practicing, right? And practice with a trusted friend, somebody who, you know, you feel comfortable with, or work with a coach, but get practiced in telling them. And then apply your stories in presentations, during meetings, when you're writing, when you're gathering knowledge. Just apply your stories. Just constantly think about, where's another opportunity I have to share a story? And then go craft some more, right? 3 steps you can take tomorrow. You want to listen for the stories around you that you can gather. Listen first. And as a leader, I actually, when I teach my MBA classes, I say, okay, the difference between leadership and management, one difference is that as a leader, right, about 60 to 70% of your time, you want to be listening for stories around the organization, right? And the other time directing work. And so listening takes on critical importance the higher you go up in the food chain in an organization. Think of stories you would like to tell about the organization, customers, or staff, and make a list, right? Start capturing these and start making a list of the stories that you want to tell. And then get together with your direct reports or other people in the organization to brainstorm stories and how you want to share them. Get other people excited about the opportunity to share stories and the difference it can make for your organization. All right. So what are your takeaways from today? We're at the top of the hour. We'll probably have 1 minute left, but I hope you had some good takeaways from today. If you want to put anything in the chat box, that would be really great. I do want to say that there are some resources here for you. There's my newsletter if you'd like it. The book, Business Storytelling for Dummies, best place to get that is on Amazon. That's the cheapest. But on my website, I also have a DIY story kit, which is a lot of worksheets and templates and how-to guides for working with stories in your organization and also crafting stories. And also the book, Business Storytelling for Dummies, has full chapters on how to evoke stories, how to craft stories, and then how to apply stories in various places in your organization. But then the last also is that I curate articles on business storytelling. I've created the largest free library of these resources in the world. I have over 1,700 articles. I write a review of each article, and it's all searchable. And if you want to know anything particular about business storytelling, then please let me know. You can contact me through my website, and I'll help you work through the curation and find the resources that you need. And so here's, how to contact me. And I do speak, I train on storytelling, I coach executives in business storytelling, and here's how to reach me. So, whew, boom, we are done, and I think we just made it. Zachary, how'd we do?
Yeah, we did great. And one real quick question I think you can answer very quickly here. We've got a member asking if you could please repeat the second and third types of stories.
Oh, yes. So the first is your origin story. The second category of stories are your people and results stories, where the people that you're talking about are the heroes of the story. And then the third would be your future story. And this is the difference that your organization or your leadership is making on the world, right? How the world is different because your organization is providing its products and services, or how you as a leader are focused on making a difference and what kind of difference that is. So there you go.
Great. Thanks so much. Getting some good audience feedback. Appreciative. Saying that you know your stuff. Great insight. Can't wait to tell my own stories. Lots of great feedback. Thank you, Karen Dietz, so much for engaging us in this great conversation, inspiring us to remember the importance of telling stories, and more importantly, the right and the best ways to do that, to maximize those efforts and results of doing so. Thank you to all of our members on the behalf of the HRO Services and Technology Association. We do have some great thought leadership councils coming up just yet this week. Wayne Termel, how leading remotely has changed the game or not. Albert Shen, how to use social media for recruitment and candidate engagement, is this Thursday. And on Friday, we have closing competency gaps to improve safety management. So on behalf of the association, thank you, Karen. Thank you to our members, and we'll talk to you next time. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.